Dr. Eugenia Cheng is a mathematician and concert pianist. She is scientist in resident at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and won tenure at the University of Sheffield, UK. She has previously taught at the universities of Cambridge, Chicago, and Nice, and holds a PhD in pure mathematics from the University of Cambridge. Alongside her research in category theory and undergraduate teaching, her aim is to rid the world of math phobia. Eugenia was an early pioneer of math on YouTube, and her videos have been viewed around 15 million times to date. Her first popular math book, How to Bake Pie, was featured on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and Beyond Infinity was shortlisted for the Royal Society Science Book Prize 2017. She also writes the Everyday Math column for the Wall Street Journal and recently completed her first mathematical art commission for Hotel EMC2 in Chicago. Her latest book, The Art of Logic in an Illogical World, was released in July of 2018. Please welcome Dr. Eugenia Cheng.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement to offer my respect to the indigenous inhabitants of these lands. Chicago is part of the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, along with other tribes. In fact, Chicago is home to the country's third largest urban Native American population, with over 140 tribal nations represented, in large part as a consequence of the devastating relocation program of the 1950s. I believe it's important for us to think about the many legacies of violence, displacement, and migration that bring us together today, and to take action to support Indigenous people. So thank you very much to C2ST for inviting me to give another talk for the program, and thank you all for coming to hear me speak about this, and thank you to the Chicago Public Libraries for hosting this event. This is, in fact, my local library. I'm very lucky to have this as my local library, and I think we're very lucky that libraries still exist. I think libraries are pretty magic, that you can access all books. Everyone can access books for free. I think that's really amazing, and I hope that we'll all work to support the work of the libraries so that we can continue this. I am going to talk about logic in what can seem like an impossibly illogical world. It can seem sometimes that we are drowning in a world where there is just nothing but divisive arguments and conflict and fake news, victimhood, exploitation, prejudice, blame, bigotry, and minuscule attention spans. It can seem that we're doomed to be stuck in echo chambers, only talking to people who already agree with us. Is all hope lost? I say no, which is why I'm here and which is why I wrote this book. I think that there is something that we can do about this. And one of the things that can help us, I think, is logic and the discipline of mathematical thinking. I wrote this book after working with students at the School of the Art Institute for a while, and I developed ways to get them interested in abstract mathematics and believe it's relevant to them. And I really think that when you're teaching, it's really important to understand what motivates your students and tap into that motivation rather than imposing your own motivation onto their heads. And when I was in Sheffield, the thing that seemed to motivate my students the most was food. And that's why my first book came out the way it did, all about food. But then at the Art Institute, it didn't seem to be food that most motivated the students. It seemed to be questions of social justice and politics. And so I developed more and more ways to illuminate those questions using techniques of mathematical thinking. And I realized that that's what I do all the time anyway. My brain works like that, which is why I'm a mathematician. And also that's why my brain works like that, because I've been trained like that so much. And so I automatically use those methods even when I haven't made them explicit. And what I realized is that I can make them explicit, and that will help people who don't have those things in the forefront of their consciousness quite as much as I do as a mathematician. And so I realized that what I could do was write down all these things I'd done with my art students and try and share them as widely as possible to help more people. And so that's what I did. And so this book came out it emerged rather fast after that because it seemed so incredibly urgent. And that's why I always talk about these questions with my students now. Because somehow previously I thought, oh, I'm a mathematician, I shouldn't talk about politics in math. And then I flipped to the exact opposite way around and I thought, this is too important. I need to talk about it all the time. And especially because if those are the things that my students are worrying about all the time in their daily lives, I can't ask them to stop worrying about it when they come into a math class, because then they won't listen to me. They'll just keep worrying about those things. So instead, I will bring those questions together and ask what math can do to help with that. So there is an idea that pure mathematics is a framework for agreeing on things. There are many myths about math. Some people think that math is just about numbers and equations, and some people think it's just about getting the right answer. And it does involve numbers and equations, but it's much more than that. And every academic discipline comes with, or is built on, a framework for deciding what counts as good information or not. And that framework is what's really important. Otherwise, we're stuck being the kinds of people who just decide what we think is true for no particular reason except that we think it, or that somebody we really like thinks it. And that's not such a robust framework. So academic disciplines come up with frameworks that can be tested, replicated, and that many different people from the discipline can agree on whether the framework says that this is good information or not. And so math is one of those frameworks that's based on logic. And there is a traditional view of pure math as being extremely removed from daily life. So that's the very abstract part. That's the part that my research is in. And I used to believe this as well. I used to believe that pure math is useful to applied math. Applied math is useful to science, and science is useful to engineering and medicine, and that's useful to the world, to a kind of quantitative part of the world. And this is a very narrow view of what pure math does. And I used to believe this. I used to think, well, my work is very far removed from daily life, but it has an epic knock-on effect, and eventually, somewhere down the line that I can barely even see, it will be useful to somebody. But now, I believe, or I see, what I've known all along, which is that pure math is about how to think. And thus, it is about the entire human world, at least the part that thinks, which sometimes seems to be not the whole human world. But wouldn't it be nice if all the human world thought more? So I'm going to talk about how pure math starts with analogies, and that we think about interconnectedness between things. We study relationships between different situations and people and things, and that it enables us to pivot between different situations when we've seen a similarity between those situations. And finally, I will bring this all together to say what I think intelligence is and how I think pure math can contribute to how intelligent we are able to be in the world. So, first of all, analogies. I like to say that pure mathematics is a theory of analogies, and it happens a bit like this, that say you have two apples and two bananas, those things have something in common between them, which is that they are both two of something, and so they're both two things. And that, at the very beginning of math, is where we get the idea of numbers from. Numbers are an analogy between different situations, but they're abstract because we've forgotten some details about the situation in order to see what's similar in two different cases. Now, abstractions and analogies aren't unique. There are different ways we could do it. So here, for example, we could have said it was two fruits rather than two things, and that would still be true, but then we wouldn't be able to include quite as many examples in our analogy. For example, we would not be able to include two chairs. Maybe we want to include two chairs. So if we go further up to the level of two things, then we get to include the two chairs as well. And this is the point of abstraction. It can seem like you're getting further and further away from real life, but the point is to encompass more examples and be able to study more things at the same time. And unfortunately, that isn't always made clear in math classes. There are wonderful teachers who do make it clear, and then maybe some other people don't get a chance to see that this is the point of math. It's not just endless amounts of fiddling around with random equations for no particular reason. So here's another slightly more profound example. If you have 1 plus 2 and 2 plus 3, then those are both examples of A plus B. And people sometimes say to me, I was fine with math until the numbers became letters. So here the numbers have become letters, but I'm going to show you what the point is of turning them into letters. So here, 1 times 2 and 2 times 3 are both examples of A times B. But now we can go even further up, because A plus B and A times B are both examples of A something B, where that something is some kind of binary operation, which means it takes in 2 things and produces 1 answer. And addition and multiplication are both examples of that, and there are loads of other examples as well. So this has progressed through levels of abstraction that you might see at different levels of school. So this bottom level is kind of what you do in elementary school arithmetic, and then this level is like middle school or algebra, and then this top level is what you do maybe when you're a math major at university and you're studying abstract algebra. Things like group theory. And so it's not that one of these levels is better than the others, and it's not that one is correct and the others are wrong. It's that they illuminate different aspects of the situation, and the key is to pick one that's good for what you're trying to illuminate right now. My wonderful PhD supervisor, Martin Hyland, always said that the aim isn't to find the highest possible level of abstraction. The aim is to find a good level for what you're trying to do. And in math, what's really important is that we make very clear what level we're working at. We take it very seriously as a thing and turn that into a concept that we actually study. Whereas in life, we sometimes get confused, or we allow ambiguity into the situation because we don't make precise what level of abstraction we're using. We just say that something is analogous to something else, and then someone who doesn't like that idea might yell, no, it's not, or they might yell, well, if you think that's analogous, you're also saying something, something, something. And arguments like that are very divisive because we haven't actually talked about the thing that we're really talking about. So here's an example of how that can go wrong when we're talking about marriage. So some people think that straight marriage and same-sex marriage are really the same, and some people think that they're really not the same. And then we can yell back and forth about that. But the point is that if you think that marriage is between an unrelated man and woman, then indeed that does not encompass same-sex marriage. But some of us think that it's about 2 unrelated adults, and it doesn't matter what sex they are, in which case same-sex marriage is entirely part of that. Now, if we don't say exactly what we're talking about, some people hallucinate that we have gone much further up than we have, and they say things like, oh, well, the next thing you know, you'll be allowing incest. I've redacted this in case there are smaller people in the room. So it might go further up than that. If someone thinks you've gone even further than 2 adults and you've got to the level of 2 humans, or maybe to the level of 2 living creatures, or perhaps to the level of 2 creatures. So the point is that although just because some of us have gone up to this level, it does not mean that we have slid all the way up to the top. And if we make this precise, it doesn't solve the argument, but I think it means we can have a more sensible argument about what we're really thinking about. So on to interconnectedness. Interconnectedness is something that helps us in math because it means that we can, if we understand connections between things, we can transfer understanding, and we can package things up into single units so that we don't have to understand everything in isolation. This is my favorite diagram of interconnectedness. The standard London Underground map. It's a really good map. It's really useful for finding your way around, but it's not geographically accurate. So all it shows is the way that stations are connected with each other and via what lines. But unlike, say, the New York subway map, it is not geographically accurate, which means you often get hapless American tourists trying to take the train from, say, Leicester Square to Covent Garden or something, when actually they're about 2 feet away from each other. So this is the geographically accurate London Underground map, which would be much more difficult to use actually to get around London. But so it's not wrong, it's just different, and it's focusing on something different. I think it's very interesting. And so it's not that one of these maps is correct and the other one is incorrect, it's that they're focusing on different aspects of the situation. And this is what we do in math. We decide to focus on a particular aspect of the situation. We're not claiming that's all there is, but if we perform an abstraction and focus there, then it can help us to understand something about the situation and also see similarities between different situations so that we can make the best use of our poor, feeble brain power. So here's a situation of interconnectedness that I sometimes think about to do with relationship breakdown, which often happens because of something like this, that maybe one person, Alex, say, feels disrespected. And as a result, Alex can't show love to their partner. And maybe their partner, Sam, thus feels unloved, and thus Sam can't show respect, as a result of which Alex feels disrespected. And so we go round and round this circle. So these two arrows are action responses to the situation, and these two arrows are feelings responses. And once we've understood that this is a vicious circle with actions and feelings, we can think about what would be the best arrow to try and break. And maybe then we can say, well, it's difficult to change your feelings about a reaction to something because your feelings are just your feelings. But maybe you can change how you act in response to those feelings. So maybe when Alex feels disrespected, they could still try and show love despite that, and then the vicious circle won't happen. Or maybe, even when Sam feels unloved, they could still show respect to Alex, and that could mean that the cycle isn't broken. And then the final question is, well, who should be the one to break that cycle? And I read one book that said that whoever is more mature should break the cycle. I quite like that response. So this doesn't completely solve the problem, but it does help us see how we might go about solving the problem. And it also enables us to think about other vicious circles that have worse consequences, such as cycles of police violence, especially against black people in this country. So maybe some people think that it's because police feel threatened by black people, and so they defend themselves. And as a result, black people feel threatened by the police, so they defend themselves, as a result of which the police feel threatened. And this is a vicious cycle, also involving feelings and actions. Now, I think it's really important to point out that even if we broke the part about black people defending themselves against police, because they don't always do that, even when they absolutely behave as they're supposed to, they can still have things happen to them if they are, say, just sitting at home eating ice cream. And so maybe in that case, it's not going to stop the situation, no matter how much black people behave exactly in the way that everyone keeps telling them that they should. So how about the police? Well, maybe we can ask why they feel threatened. Why should they feel threatened? They're the police. They hold all the power. And also, can we train them to take action differently, to de-escalate situations instead of escalate them? We know they're able to because they are often able to do that when white people are involved rather than black people. And so we can then ask who should break this cycle. Well, I believe that the people in power should break it, and that is clearly the police. Of course, if they don't want to, then they won't. So it hasn't actually solved the situation, but maybe we can have a slightly more sensible conversation about it rather than just yelling backwards and forwards. So another type of interconnectedness is when there are many different factors combining to cause an outcome, usually a bad outcome. And people on the internet often say, well, it's just because it really is that simple. And whenever someone says it really is that simple, it's usually not really that simple. And I get it, the world is a complicated place, and we have to simplify the world to understand it because of our poor, feeble brains. But one way to simplify the world is to just ignore important details about it and delude yourself. That's not a great way to simplify the world. A better way, I think, to simplify the world is to become more intelligent, because then the world has become simpler relative to your brain. And one way we can do that is to understand interconnected factors. So the United incident was that egregious case where United needed to get some people off a plane, no one wanted to leave, so they dragged someone off and he was injured. So the end result was that there was injury. And some people said, oh, they just shouldn't have used so much force. And some other people said, well, if you do what you're told, you won't get injured. It really is that simple. And I read one editorial in the Times of London saying, it's your fault, all of you. It's your fault that this happened, because you sometimes miss flights. And that's why they have to overbook flights, so it's your fault for missing flights. And I thought, well, that's a bit extreme. So I decided to draw a diagram of all the main things I could think of. The end result was that injury occurred. And it was because the guy refused to leave, and also that security used force, and also that the airline called security in the first place. Now, why did he refuse to leave? Well, he needed to get to work, and apparently he needed to get to work for his shift as a doctor in a hospital, which you might think is a reasonable reason to want to get to work. Now, why did the airline even choose that person? Some unanswered questions maybe about racial profiling. And why did the airline need to decide to kick people off? Well, because nobody volunteered. Why did nobody volunteer? Two things. The airline offered too little money for the amount that they wanted to get home. And Why did the airline even decide to remove people? Well, because the flight was too full, and also that they need to get some crew somewhere. Why did they need to get the crew somewhere so badly? Was there an issue with their scheduling? And why was the flight too full? Well, yes, because it was overbooked and there were not enough no-shows. So this finally gets to the point that why do they overbook flights? Well, because people often miss flights. So it really is this simple. And if you're capable of understanding a diagram of interconnectedness like this as a single unit, then you have simplified it to one thing. And you've done it better than just ignoring stuff. And so packaging things up into units is what we do a lot. We do it when we're reading. When you first learn to read, you have to go letter by letter, right? But then, and that's kind of arduous, but then you start seeing whole words and you don't have to go letter by letter. And if you can really speed read, then you read in whole sentences or maybe even whole paragraphs. And you could read a book more quickly by just ignoring every letter of the word except the first letter, and you wouldn't get very much out of that situation. So another contentious situation where people say it really is that simple is about putting on weight. I used to be quite a lot larger, and then I managed to become less large, and I'd like to keep it that way. I don't say that anyone else should do that. I'm just saying that I would like to do that for many reasons. And people often say, oh, well, losing weight's not rocket science. And for a start, rocket science is just applied math. I can do that. Losing weight is way harder than rocket science. So people say, oh, you just have to eat less and exercise more. So let's think about that for a second. So why do I gain weight? Well, I take in more energy than I burn, which, yes, is because I eat too much and I exercise too little. But it's also because of my metabolism. And my metabolism slows down when I eat too little and I exercise too much. So it's already because I eat too much and I eat too little and I exercise too much and I exercise too little. It's very simple. So my metabolism is also affected by genetics and how much I sleep. And why do I eat too much? Well, I like food, and also I eat for emotional reasons, and people who don't emotionally eat will never understand the people who do, and the people who do will never understand the people who don't. And my genetics and my upbringing also mean I really like food, and social pressure to eat too much, and social norms cause the social pressure and emotions, and time pressure means I get stressed and I sleep less. Life happens. And then there's also the entire food industry and diet industry, which is simultaneously trying to get us to eat too much and then to believe that we need to go on diets to lose it. And they make sure the diets don't work so that we can get stuck in this cycle where they can continue to make money out of us. Plus, when I gain weight, I then eat too little, exercise too much, and I also get upset about it. So it's really this simple. And if you're not afraid of a whole diagram of interconnectedness like this, then it really is this simple. You can look at it and decide which arrows are the easiest ones to break. There are some that I know that I will never be able to break, and there are others that I can try and break. And so I try and break those ones and give up breaking the ones I know I can't break. So moving on to another kind of relationship. So this is something that's more obviously mathematical, about the factors of 30, and it's one of the things I do often with my students, and they push me to develop it much further than I originally envisaged. So maybe we can remember what the factors of 30 are. They are 1 and 2, 3, 5, 6, 10, 15, and 30. Very good. It's not very interesting. It's a bunch of numbers in a straight line. So we live in a three-dimensional world, so we write on two-dimensional pieces of paper in one-dimensional straight lines. We stuff our thoughts into a one-dimensional straight line, where maybe they don't want to be in a one-dimensional straight line. Maybe they have natural geometry in higher dimensions, which is why I like to say I don't tidy the papers on my desk, because they have natural geometry in higher dimensions. They don't want to be in a one-dimensional straight line. So we can find the natural geometry of this situation by thinking about which numbers are also factors of each other and drawing a kind of family tree. So 3 goes at the top like a sort of great-grandparent, and 6, 10, and 15 are directly descended from 30, and 5 goes into 10 and 15, and I don't need a line from 30 to 5 because it's like grandparents in a family tree. I can deduce that through the single generation difference. So 2 goes into 6 and 10, 3 goes into 6 and 15, and 1 goes into 2, 3, and 5. So now we see it's a cube. which is a little bit more interesting than a bunch of numbers in a straight line. And we can ask ourselves many questions about this. We can ask ourselves, does every number make a cube? Why does it make a cube? What other shapes can we make with different numbers? And maybe we can see that the reason it's a cube is because these three numbers here are the prime factors. Those are the ones that don't have any other factors except 1 and themselves. So they have to be directly next to 1 with nothing in between. So if I write out the factors at each corner, right, this is 2 times 3. And 10 is 2 times 5. So here we have the single prime numbers. Here we have pairs of prime numbers. And at the top, we have 3 different prime numbers. And that's why it's a cube. And then maybe we can say, oh, well, it didn't have to be 2, 3, and 5. I might as well call them A, B, and C, because it could have been anything. So now the numbers have turned into letters. And there is going to be a point. So the first point is, I can immediately do this to some other A, B, and C, like 2, 3, and 7. 2 times 3 times 7 is 42. And the factors of 42 are these. And now that I've had this deep insight about it being about prime numbers, I can build the diagram up from the bottom instead. So 2, 3, and 7 are the prime factors. 6, 14, and 21 are the factors that are products of 2 prime numbers. And then at the top, we have 42. And if I draw the other diagrams out, the middle one is the exact same diagram, but with a 7 in place of every 5. And then up at the level of A, B, and C, it's exactly the same diagram now. So we don't have to say it's analogous. This is the thing that is producing the analogy. And I'm going to show you in a moment what the point is. But first, I want to stress something about the first diagram, which is that 6 is less than 7, which doesn't sound very profound. But it is when you consider the fact that 6 is higher than 7 in this diagram, although it's smaller than 7. And this shows that we've got 2 different hierarchies on these numbers. One is just size, and the other one is this hierarchy, which is by how many prime factors you have. And those hierarchies don't agree. And whenever you have 2 hierarchies that don't agree, say on the same set of people in life, that can be a source of antagonism. For example, if you have someone at work who's older than you, but the older person is more junior, then that can be a source of antagonism because it's 2 hierarchies that don't agree. So I'm going to come back to that, but I want to show you what we can now do with the fact that these are A's, B's, and C's, because they don't have to be prime numbers anymore. They don't even have to be numbers. A, B, and C can be anything. For example, they could be 3 types of privilege, such as rich, white, and male. And then at the next level down, we'll have all the sets of 2 types of privilege. So rich, white, rich male, and white male. And then the people with 1 type of privilege, rich, white, and male. And then at the bottom, the people with none of those 3 types of privilege. So I just picked 3 kinds of privilege, and you could do this with any 3 kinds of privilege. And if I put the missing words back in, we have rich, white, non-men, rich, non-white men, and so on. The first thing I want to stress is that whenever I talk about this, everyone in the room spontaneously identifies as non-rich. And we are all non-rich compared with somebody else, but we're also all very rich compared with some other people. And that's something that I'm going to come back to. So this diagram, importantly, just shows direct loss of 1 type of privilege. And many people misunderstand the theory of privilege, probably willfully, and they get angry, and they point at a super rich black sports star, and they say, see, that means there's no such thing as white privilege. Or what Bill O'Reilly said on the radio, which was, I went to Hawaii and got sunburnt. That shows there's no white privilege. Yeah. So that's not what white privilege means. It doesn't mean that all white people are better off than all non-white people. It's that whiteness makes you better off in society than you would be if everything else about you stayed the same except that you weren't white anymore. And that's an important difference. So another thing we can think about here is like 6 is less than 7. We can think about the absolute amount of privilege that we think people have in society. So this is sort of a matter of opinion now, but I think that rich white non-men are probably doing better than rich non-white men, who are in turn probably doing better than non-rich white men. And then at the bottom level, the same thing. And then we can compare between the levels. And I think that rich non-white non-men are certainly doing better than non-rich white men because wealth makes up for an awful lot of things. And we can think of some extreme examples like Michelle Obama or Oprah Winfrey, who are definitely doing better than poor white men in the middle of America with no jobs and no employment possibilities. So I think it's really like this. It's a cuboid of privilege, not a cube. And this has helped me to understand why some people are so angry about the theory of privilege, especially poor white men or other white men who feel that they have some other disadvantage that's being overlooked. Because they get told that they have two types of privilege, but they see people who have some less privilege who are doing much better than them in society. So they don't actually feel any of the manifestations of their privilege. And I think it's really important to understand the source of that anger rather than simply get angry with them in return. So we can use structures like this to pivot between analogous situations. For example, in these three situations, 30, 42, and rich white men played analogous roles in those situations. And we can think of any power differential situation. For example, the structural power that male people have over female people. Again, this doesn't mean that every male person has power over every female person. It means that the structures of society are set up to favor men overall, just like they're set up to favor white people and rich people. And so male people, white people, and rich people play analogous roles in those power situations. This is not the case if we turn the arrow of the power situation the other way up. And so this gives us a sense in which, when male people, say, are sexually harassing female people, that is different from when female people sexually harass male people, which unfortunately they do. There is a sense in which that is the same, which is that it is people sexually harassing people, and that's bad. But there's a sense in which it is different, which is that when it's a power group doing it to a group that doesn't hold power, there is something else going on. And we can, once we've acknowledged that there is a difference, we can ask ourselves how that difference manifests itself in how men and women experience things. So something might not be at the top in one context, but then be at the top in another context. In this situation, rich white men were at the top, but if we looked at this part of the diagram, now the rich white non-men are at the top. And we could focus our attention entirely on a smaller context, for example, the context of women, and we could pick three types of privilege among women, such as rich, white, and cisgendered. And then we'll see that we have an entirely analogous diagram, except now rich, white, cis women occupy the analogous position that rich white men do in broader society. And this has helped me to understand why there is so much anger towards rich white women, especially in some parts of the feminist movement at the moment. Because maybe they only see themselves as underprivileged relative to men, especially if they predominantly mix with only white people. And then they don't see how privileged they are relative to all the other women. And again, I think it's better to understand these things, where the source of these problems are coming from, rather than simply just everyone getting angry with everybody else. So the rich white women, if they only see themselves at the bottom of a diagram and don't realize that they're there at the top of another diagram, then they're not seeing all of the situation, and that can cause antagonism. And we can all perform pivots like this because we are all more privileged than somebody and less privileged than somebody else. So we can construct different diagrams in which we occupy different positions so that we can understand what it's like to occupy different positions. And yes, some very, very underprivileged people, it will be much harder for them to construct a diagram where they're at the top, but they could still do it. And this is a way that we can use abstract mathematical structures to help us empathize with other people, which was actually a surprise even to me, because usually we don't use abstract mathematics and empathy in the same sentence, at least not in a positive way. But I realized that empathy is about analogies between people. And that if mathematics helps us to find analogies, then it can help us with empathy. So here are some pivots that I do in my life. As an Asian person, I feel that I am less privileged racially than white people. But also, I acknowledge that I am much more privileged than many other non-white people. In fact, I think Asian people in this country are probably the most privileged among all non-white people. And so I can do this pivot to understand what it's like to be both underprivileged and overprivileged racially. And there's also the one about wealth, where I am doing fine, but I'm not so rich that I never need to work again. Although, in fact, being rich would never stop me working. That's not my criterion for working. I will keep working while I see any injustice in the world, and that's going to be forever. So I'm always going to keep working. Whereas there are some people who are really struggling. They may be working very hard but still unable to make ends meet. Maybe they're working 4 part-time jobs, or maybe no one is letting them work. Maybe they can't get a job. Maybe they're sick or something that is meaning that they're really doing worse than me. And so we're all doing worse than somebody and better than somebody else. And so we can perform this pivot in order to understand it. And here's the one involving white women, and we can do this for any 2 types of privilege. If there's someone with one type of privilege and they only see that they are lacking one of them and they don't see that they've got one of them, then antagonism will occur. So I bring all this together to think about what I think intelligence is, because sometimes people think that we should just be trying to be completely rational. And I don't think that makes any sense, because logic has to be deduced from something. Logic enables us to deduce things from other things. You can't deduce it from nothing. And in math, the things that are our starting points for our deductions are called basic axioms that we don't try to prove. And in life, I think those are our fundamental beliefs. And those are our starting points for the rest of the things that we believe. And we can have very different fundamental beliefs from somebody else. But if we're both logical based on our fundamental beliefs, then we will both end up believing different things despite both being logical. So I don't think it's the point to just say that other people aren't being logical, whereas I'm being logical. But we can think about what other people's logic is and use empathy to understand their logic. If we just keep telling them they're being illogical, we'll never get anywhere in these conversations. And so I think that being intelligent involves using logic and emotions together. And I thought about it, and I think that it involves being reasonable, being powerfully logical, and also helpful. So being reasonable is about being able to be reasoned with. There are some people who believe things, and they will continue to believe them regardless of no matter how much evidence comes up, or no matter what happens, they will continue to believe it. And that is not reasonable, because there is no way to reason with them. So I think that being reasonable is about not just using logic, but having some kind of framework for deciding what counts as good information, and importantly, for deciding when it's time to change your mind. Now, being powerfully logical is more than just about being logical, because you can be logical and not get anywhere at all. So some people say that they don't believe in same-sex marriage because they think that marriage should be between a man and a woman, which is just really saying the same thing twice. So if you say that you don't believe in same-sex marriage because you don't believe in same-sex marriage, that's not illogical, but it's not really powerfully logical, because it hasn't got us any further. It hasn't progressed our argument, nor has it helped us understand why you think the things you do. So being powerfully logical involves not just being logical, but having techniques so that you can build arguments that take you further away from your fundamental beliefs, or so that you can unpack what you believe to really uncover what your fundamental beliefs are. And finally, I think being helpful is really important, because you can be as intelligent as you want, but if you sit in a cave and do nothing about it, I don't think that counts. I think that being helpful is really important, and that involves using techniques of logic and also engaging emotions so that we can actually communicate with other people. If we just pit logic and emotions in a battle against each other, I don't think logic can ever win, because emotions are much stronger than that. And I believe in Carlos Chipola's theory of stupidity. So Chipola says that there is always the same proportion of stupid people in no matter what group of people you're looking at. So that could be professors, it could be students, it could be kindergartners, it could be maybe there's more stupid people among politicians. And he also says that it's always more than you're expecting, even when you've taken that into account. And so he does have a very precise definition of stupidity, and it's a 2-dimensional definition, and this axis is how much you benefit yourself, and that axis is how much you benefit others. And so if you're in the bottom right-hand quadrant, then you benefit yourself and you hurt other people, and he says you are a bandit. If you're in the top left-hand quadrant, then you benefit other people, but you hurt yourself, and he calls that unfortunate. And you can think of it as being a martyr. And I used to be like that, and I think that many women especially feel pressure from society to sacrifice ourselves for the good of other people all the time, whether it's our families or our students or somebody else. And I hurt myself a lot by staying in a job that was making me really miserable, because I believed that it was really important to help other people and not worry about myself. I thought it was selfish to try and care for myself rather than to think about helping other people. And I'm glad that I don't do that anymore. Now, if you are down here, then you hurt other people and you hurt yourself at the same time, and that is stupid. So if you're up here, then you benefit other people and you benefit yourself simultaneously. And that is what he says is intelligent. And I agree with that. I don't think intelligence is anything to do with what grades you get, or what kind of degree you have, or how many degrees you have, or how much money you earn, or what position you have in society, or how many houses you own, or what your job title is. I think it's about the extent to which you can figure out how to use your individual abilities and advantages to help yourself and other people at the same time. And I think that we can use logic and emotions together to do this, because we can use logic to help us empathize with other people, and we need to use empathy to help us understand other people's logic as well. And I think that we can create this virtuous circle with the help of abstract mathematics. And I hope that you will join me in using some of the techniques of abstract mathematics to go out into the world and be intelligent. Thank you very much.